Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Emma Raffi. I'm the manager of programs and exhibition production here at the Eastman Museum. This is my first program introduction. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm so excited to have all of you here today. This is an In Focus program, which highlights our staff and researchers that are working with the collection, and it kind of provides you a behind-the-scenes look at what's happening here. So today, Curatorial Associate Meghan Jordan is going to discuss her selections from the latest rotation in the collection gallery, challenging us to think about how photography documents and disseminates information about war over time. So I'm going to invite Meghan to the podium.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the George Eastman Museum. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to share the museum's land acknowledgement. The George Eastman Museum resides within the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Onondaga, or the Great People of the Hill, known in English as the Seneca people. Specifically, the museum occupies land ceded in the 1788 Phelps-Gorham Purchase, which was procured under false pretenses, duress, and coercion. We pledge to honor and better serve the Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, cultures, and experiences. At the George Eastman Museum, we are committed to sharing and amplifying Indigenous voices and work to do so locally, internationally in our exhibitions, collections, programs, and interpretations. I am Meghan Jordan, the Curatorial Associate in the Department of Photography, and I curated the current selections from the collection exhibition. Selections from the Collection is an exhibition that is always on view in the museum's collection gallery, and it is always a brief look at photographic history from the announcement of the medium to the present through objects in the collection. It changes about 2 times a year and is curated by a different member of the Department of Photography. Sometimes the rotations have themes, and the theme of this rotation is war and conflict, which is one of my scholarly interests in studying photographic history. The exhibition aims to challenge us to think critically about how photography documents and disseminates information about war, and how photographers' approaches to recording war has shifted over time. So before we dive into photographs in the exhibition, I wanted to point out that there is a content warning and curator statement posted outside of the gallery. It reads as the following. The exhibition features photographs of and reacting to war and conflict. It includes graphic depictions of dead and wounded individuals and of bombings and explosions. The curator of this rotation of selections from the collection has been planning this exhibition for multiple years. We acknowledge the suffering and hardship of people impacted by recent events and sorrowfully note that the topics in this exhibition remain as relevant as ever. It is our hope that this exhibition provides perspectives and insights that allow visitors to think critically about photographic history in relation to war and conflict, as well as the lives of those directly affected by such events. So if you need to step out of this lecture at any point, please do so. We will be talking about some difficult images. This exhibition spans the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 to the recent war in Afghanistan. And it includes artists responding to war and conflict. So the earliest photograph in the exhibition is by Roger Fenton, and it documents the Crimean War. Plateau before Sebastopol, Turkish tents in the distance, is a salted paper print from 1855. When in the gallery, you will notice that this photograph is covered with a curtain. Please, when you are down there, lift the curtain to view it. It is under the curtain due to the salted paper process being far more light sensitive than other photographic processes. Now, Roger Fenton was an English photographer who was sent by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert to the front line of the Crimean War. They, along with a publisher, funded the photographic expedition, which had the goal of creating photographs for sale that would convince the British population that the Crimean War was positive for their country, as they aligned with the French against Russia. Most of Fenton's photographs show quiet encampments, like this one in the collection, and well cared for soldiers, which is very different from military reports that describe flooded trenches, soldiers without proper equipment or clothing, and corpses lying amongst the living. So here in the start of this exhibition is a use of photography to document war in a way that doesn't exactly tell the truth to the public. It's also an example of very early photographic documentation of war. In fact, the Crimean War is often recognized as the first photographed military conflict. Another early example of a photographed war is the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865. In the exhibition is the 1863 photograph, A Harvest of Death, by Timothy O'Sullivan, which documents the aftermath of Gettysburg. O'Sullivan took this photograph when he was employed by Alexander Gardner, both photographs having previously been employed by the famed Matthew B. Brady, and there are a few Brady cameras in the exhibition. However, Gardner opened his own business in the spring of 1863 and hired many of Brady's old employees. At the end of the war, Gardner published Gardner's photographic sketchbook of the war. Now, this print that's on view is not directly a plate from the book, but the photography collection does have a copy or a plate directly from the book, which is this photograph. And you can see it has informative text, the title, but when I was preparing for the exhibition, this one object was unavailable for the exhibition. So I chose the print that I just showed. But one day, this past April, I was looking in the museum's database at the two prints when I noticed that the horizon line and figures are different between the two. I panicked and contacted my colleagues in conservation, who assured me that it was gonna be okay. They would get to the bottom of it. So Natasha Kung, then graduate intern in photograph conservation here, and who is now the Cragen W. Bowen Paper Conservation Fellow at the Harvard Art Museums, did amazing research. She took these photo micrographs. So on the left is the print where figures are visible, which is the one not in the exhibition. And then on the right are the figures in the print in the exhibition where they are faded or not visible. And here is the horizon line between the two prints. So there was definitely some degree of retouching that occurred in the negative before the specific exhibition print was produced. Natasha is doing additional research, and I've searched online other museum collections to see if any other institutions have a similar print, but I have yet to find one. So that was some excitement in preparing for this exhibition, and hopefully more will come from the research. Natasha said she is hoping to look at Harvard's copy of the photograph under the microscope soon. It was the photographs that were produced during the American Civil War and their circulation that prompted the US military to truly value photography. Gardner wrote in Gardner's photographic sketchbook of the war accompanying this image, quote, "Such a picture conveys a useful morale. It shows the blank horror and reality of war in opposition to its pageantry. Here are the dreadful details. Let them aid in preventing such another calamity falling upon the nation," end quote. The US Army Signal Corps had been established in 1860 to create and manage communication for the armed forces, and had already played an important part in the Civil War, but it did not yet include using photography. It was not until the Spanish-American War of 1898 that they employed the medium. During World War I, photography was officially assigned to the Signal Corps, and for the first time, civilian photographers were not allowed in designated battle zones. This meant that the US Army controlled all imagery coming in and out of their battlefields. These are two stereo views that are on view in the exhibition from World War I. With America's entrance into World War II, the military ramped up training soldiers in photography to send the news of the war back home. One of those men was Lieutenant Mark A. Freeman. This is his identification badge. Freeman entered the United States Enlisted Reserve Corps in 1932 and underwent military training multiple times before the start of World War II. He was called up and inducted into the United States Army in 1941. In 1942, he was sent overseas to Northern Ireland for training with orders to fight in the war. However, on the ship, he suffered a burst appendix, and due to the long recovery, he missed military training. Therefore, the Army suggested that Freeman become a photographer, and so he entered the Signal Corps Army Pictorial Service in September of 1942. There are 8 photographs by Freeman plus the ID badge that you just saw in the exhibition. However, there are nearly 3,000 photographs and negatives by him in the museum's photography collection that were gifted by his children. As a U.S. Army Signal Corps photographer, Freeman documented everything. He began at training facilities in Northern Ireland, documenting military students and their activities. He was in the field with soldiers in France. Here, American soldiers captured German soldiers. And he walked through rubble in Germany after air bombardments. Now, the U.S. Army Signal Corps was meticulous in its record keeping. You may notice that most of the prints have a number at the bottom. Here, ETO HQ44542 is the ETO is the European Theater of Operations where the image was taken. HQ is where the print originated from, so headquarters. 44 is the year it was made, so 1944. And 542 is a unique identifying number. Additionally, photographers were required to take detailed notes, which were then printed as a caption on the verso or the back of the print. It included the unique number, photographer name, and date taken. Photographs also had to pass censorship inspection and were stamped when they were cleared to be published. Based on the stamps on the verso of this print, it was labeled as confidential before being stamped as reviewed and passed. Censors also used red ink to censor image information that identified soldiers, such as in this image of a medic tending to a wounded individual in the field. Or they would censor areas of images that may leak information about Allied plans, such as in this image where a map is blocked out. Now, a well-known war correspondent for Life magazine during World War II was Robert Capa. Many of you may recognize this iconic image of soldiers landing at Omaha Beach in Normandy, France on D-Day, June 6, 1944. Capa was among the first wave of infantry to land on the beach, and he photographed 4 rolls of 35mm film that were quickly couriered to the magazine's London office. However, according to storied accounts, a horrible mistake during development caused only 11 frames to be discernible. The majority of those were published in Life magazine. You can see here, Life is completely digitized on Google Books. It's fascinating to go through. And Life magazine reached the doorsteps of millions of subscribers, and the image became one of the most iconic images of World War II. Now, what do I mean when I say an iconic image? Was I on the? Ooh. An iconic image is a photograph that becomes representative of an event to the public. So Capa's D-Day image, or Nick Ute's The Terror of War from 1972, which is also in the exhibition. This photograph depicts Kim Phuc fleeing from napalm with other children during the Vietnam War. And it was also published later that month in Life magazine. A more recent image that some may identify as iconic is Lyle Awerko's image from September 11th, 2001, also included in the exhibition. It was captured moments after the second plane hit the second tower. The photograph was featured on the cover of the September 14th, 2001 issue of Time. Awerko, who was in his office in Tribeca when he heard, quote, "the loudest, most horrible sound I'd ever heard," end quote, as in the first plane hitting, grabbed his camera and followed the noises until he discovered the source. He photographed the explosions, bodies falling from the buildings, people fleeing in the streets, and authorities doing the best that they could. Owerko's images, like many iconic photographs, brought the reality of the situation to people around the world. But his photograph on the cover of Time also let his family know that he was safe, as he was unable to make contact with them following the attacks. In an interview, he called this, quote, "the world's photo. It belongs to history," end quote. Now, the three iconic photographs that I just showed from World War II, the Vietnam War, and 9/11, are very different from photographs that were circulated from early conflicts like the American Civil War. And this is due to the improvements in photographic technology. With more compact 35mm cameras and improved processes, photographers were able to get closer to the action and record instantaneously. Rather than mainly photographing after battles, photographers were now in combat. But one thing that has remained a constant interest for photographers though, has been the making of portraits of soldiers. Portraits played a huge role in the lives of soldiers after the announcement of photography. Unlike paintings, photographic portraits were generally small objects that could be carried onto the battlefield or mailed home to loved ones, and they were comparably inexpensive. Here is a daguerreotype with applied color, dating to circa 1855. From research I've done, based on the uniform, I believe it may be a soldier from the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, but could not confirm that. It's definitely pre-Civil War. During the Civil War, portrait photography was popular as a link between soldiers on the front lines and their family back home. Here are two tintypes in one case. On the left is a man in uniform posed in front of a painted backdrop of a military camp with the American flag flying. On the right is a woman seated in a studio, potentially back home, as her husband, presumably the man on the left, is off at war. She may have cherished this object, and who knows if that man returned home. As I said, photographs were a link between the battlefield and loved ones at home, and most of the objects sent between the two were mailed via the United States Postal Service. However, some mail was unfortunately undeliverable. This may have been due to an illegible address or insufficient postage. The USPS, years before, had created the Dead Letter Office, where staff was tasked with getting undelivered mail to its destination. But when they were unsuccessful, objects would go on display in a museum at the office. And during the Civil War, people would visit this museum to see displays just like this object, to try to identify their husbands, sons, fathers, brothers, and friends. The Eastman Museum has 10 objects in the collection, like the one in the exhibit. Here is another example. And portraits of soldiers were so popular that people were requesting the photographs be made into other functional objects, such as this paperweight that is in the exhibition. It's a portrait of a World War I soldier encased in glass. Other portraits in the exhibition include this one of a Korean soldier during the Korean War taken by Margaret Bork White. Bork White is one of two women photographers represented in the exhibition. This low number is both because of the small number of women combat photographers and because what is available in the collection. But Bork White was a groundbreaking photojournalist. She was one of the first photographers on staff at Life magazine, and her image was on the cover of the first issue of Life on November 23rd, 1936. And the print, one of the prints which is in the collection, was on view a few years ago in the collection gallery. She was the first foreign photographer permitted to take pictures of industry in the Soviet Union under the country's 5-year plan. This is another photograph in the collection. She traveled to Europe during World War II to document life in Nazi-occupied countries. This is also in the collection. Here is a portrait of Bork White in her aviation gear with her camera. She was cool. So cool, I named one of my pet rabbits after her. The brown rabbit is Bork, with her friend Becker, named after Bern and Hilla Bescher, so photo nerd. But to return to this portrait in the exhibition, Bork White embedded herself with the Korean National Police as they engaged in guerrilla warfare. The photographs were published in the December 1st, 1952 issue of Life, and in the article it states, quote, "Miss Bork White strayed far from the current battle lines to cover the guerrilla war, overcoming objections of many officials who thought it was no place for a lady," end quote. And the article did not include the photograph that is in the exhibition, but it included many others, some of which are in the museum collection, such as this one and this one. There's also a certain youthful yet stoic look to the soldier in the included photograph that comes up in another portrait that I'll talk about in a moment. The other woman photographer in the exhibition is Noggle. Noggle was a woman Air Force service pilot in World War II and was a captain in the US Air Force from 1953 to 1959. After leaving the military, she flew a crop duster and performed in an aerial circus before retiring due to illness. She studied photography, and her passion for flying is obvious in her work, like in this self-portrait that is in the collection. Included in the War and Conflict exhibition is this portrait. In the early 1990s, Noggle traveled to the Soviet Union to photograph and interview her World War II counterparts, so Soviet air women from World War II. The project and the portraits and interviews are published in the book A Dance with Death, Soviet Airwomen of World War II. And it's a very powerful book to read and look at the portraits. And this here is Maria Smirnova, a major in the 46th Regiment who was honored as a hero of the Soviet Union after the war. And she made 935 combat flights. And in the publication, she describes the disjunction she felt as a woman charged with, quote, bombing, destroying, and killing, end quote. But then she was expected to go home after the war and get married and have children and be a civilian. This is another portrait from the project that's in the collection. It depicts Natalia Smirnova, a tail gunner in the 125th Guards Bomber Regiment. And in her interview, she describes the experience of falling out of the plane mid-combat, but her parachute harness caught on the machine gun, which allowed her to maneuver back into the plane mid-combat and save her life. Noggle also, earlier in life, had made portraits of her fellow American women, Air Force service pilots from World War II. This one is in the museum collection. Now, making a sort of jump in time, we have a portrait in the exhibit of a soldier from the war in Afghanistan. Photographer Louis Palu was embedded with British and American armed forces, and in 2008, he spent time in Garmsur. It was during that time that Garmsur was a location of heavy combat between the Taliban and British and American forces. So Palu made portraits of the soldiers as they returned from being on patrol or fighting. There are 15 portraits in the collection from the series, and they are meant to be exhibited in a 3x5 grid as shown in this slide. However, due to the size of the collection gallery, I was only able to include one, and Louis Palu gave me permission to do so. So the soldier in the exhibition is Damon. He's from Las Vegas, and this is his first tour in Afghanistan. He's only 20 years old, and you can see the exhaustion in his face as he looks directly at the camera. In almost all of the portraits, the subjects are making direct eye contact with the camera, and their eyes, they say a lot. Each portrait is titled with the soldier's name, their rank, age, location, sometimes their assignment in Garmsur. For instance, Ronald is 23 and has been building an observation post with sandbags. You can see the dirt on him. Palu published the book Front Towards Enemy in 2017, which contains these images in multiple forms, including postcards, a zine, and a newsprint book. He continues to photograph around the world, but right now he is focusing on the political climate in the United States with his project Political Year Zero. In the exhibition, I also wanted to provide the perspective of people other than military that are impacted by war. So I included 2 prints by Iraqi civilians from a project initiated by the Daylight Community Arts Foundation. So in 2004, the foundation gave disposable cameras to 10 Iraqi civilians with the prompt, quote, "This is an opportunity to show the American public what you want them to see." The photographs were published in an issue of Daylight magazine, and a portfolio was created, which the museum has one of. The resulting images depict scenes of everyday life in Iraq, people going to work, in dentist's office and barber shops. Here we have a family living in a garbage dump, but they're surrounded by car bombings and the frequent sight of grave diggers. It was also important for me to acknowledge in the exhibition refugees and people displaced by war and conflict. Peter Turnley is known for his incredible images documenting current events and the human condition around the world. There are 2 photographs by Turnley in the exhibit. Here is a man forced to leave his country during the Kosovo crisis, and he's searching for his family. There is this raw emotion to the image, the tears in his eyes, him clutching his wallet, which has housed these photographs of his children as they search for them. This photograph is the second by Turnley in the exhibit. It depicts a line of refugees fleeing from the Rwanda genocide crisis. In the foreground is a small child, a victim of cholera. It's estimated 12,000 refugees died of cholera during this conflict, and it became an epidemic there at the time. So it was really difficult to choose only 2 photographs by Turnley to include in the exhibition. We have about a dozen. So I'm going to show some others that I wasn't able to show. Here are displaced children in Iraq in 2003. And in preparing for this exhibition, I read a statistic which is printed on the Peter Turnley label in the gallery. In April, as I was writing the text, the organization Refugees International stated that there were more than 84 million people around the world displaced by conflict. I went to the website this week in preparation for this, and it's now stated at over 100 million people displaced by conflict around the world. So in the 6-ish months since I first read that statistic, an estimated 16 million more people have been displaced and are now in that statistic. A few other photographs by Turnley, a soldier preparing to pray in Russia. US soldiers in Kuwait looking at a burnt corpse. Militia fighters in Somalia. And Nelson Mandela after being released from being imprisoned. So Turnley has photographed historic moments, both conflicts that have been cover stories and others that are barely touched on in the news. Here's the fall of the Berlin Wall. But to sort of segue back into iconic photographs, historic moments and their impacts, I want to talk about this image, which is included in the exhibition of the mushroom cloud over Nagasaki, Japan. Nuclear weapons were developed during World War II, and within a span of 3 days, 2 were detonated on major cities in Japan. And these events in Nagasaki and Hiroshima killed between 100,000 and 200,000 people instantly. But the key word here is instantly. Millions more have died and are dying from long-term effects caused by the radiation. Some of those people are individuals, members of artist Michael Kerner's family. His mother was 11 years old and just 45 miles from Nagasaki, Japan, when the atomic bomb was detonated. His father was stationed on a US Navy observation ship in the 1950s watching nuclear tests. Their radiation exposure has impacted Kerner's entire family. He's the oldest of 5 brothers. One brother lived only a few days. The next brother was stillborn. The following son was a miscarriage, and his youngest brother succumbed to cancer at 32 years old. Both of his parents died at rather young ages as well. Kerner states, quote, "I remain hypervigilant towards my own cancer diagnosis and exhibit my own feelings of survivor's guilt. These feelings and family history and experiences drive my artistic hand." So Kerner explores this intergenerational trauma by dripping chemicals on metal plates in the darkroom. The chemicals create these sort of bursts, what he calls fractal patterns, that resemble sort of the structure of DNA and explosions. Now, another artist in the exhibit exploring trauma created by war is Patrick Nagatani. This is the photograph in the exhibition, and I've included it to respond to this photograph by Ansel Adams. Adams is well known for his landscape photography, but during World War II, he was invited by the director of the Manzanar War Relocation Center to document the people there. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, President FDR ordered more than 110,000 people of Japanese descent to be removed from their homes and sent to incarceration camps. Adams' photographs from the camps are largely at the Library of Congress, but we have this landscape photograph of the mountains surrounding the camp. Now, Patrick Nagatani's mother and maternal grandfather were incarcerated at Manzanar during World War II. Nagatani created the series Ryochi excavations, which it follows a fictional narrative of a Japanese archaeologist, Ryochi. Ryochi discovered evidence of automobile culture at significant sites around the globe. The series consists of these photographs documenting the excavations. So here we see this fictional excavation at Manzanar of a Toyota. And Nagatani wrote, quote, "With this project, I hope to challenge us to examine the ways in which photography creates, recreates, or supports a particular history. I want to consider what we accept as evidence and why," end quote. And that really resonated with me as I was preparing for this exhibition. The final work in the exhibit is this photograph by Taryn Simon from her series, An American Index of the Hidden and Unfamiliar. For this series, Simon got permission to enter sites that the American public is conscious exist, but rarely have access to. For example, she went to CIA headquarters, she went to the Lucasfilm archives. Here, Simon was able to enter the Imperial Office of the World Knights of the Ku Klux Klan in Sharpsburg, Maryland. The KKK was founded by veterans of the Confederate Army, and the statistic I found was that there were approximately 3,000 official Klan members active in the United States as of 2016, which is a kind of old statistic, but that's from the Anti-Defamation League. And I decided to end the exhibition with this work because I thought a belief, an organization that started during a war can echo through time and continue on through generations. And I think that's really important to think about. But before we end, I wanted to wrap up with a few photographs that did not make it into the exhibition. Ones that people have specifically asked me why they're not in the exhibit, such as this photograph by Joe Rosenthal, or this rather iconic image by Eddie Adams. There's only so much wall space in a gallery, and it is very difficult as a curator to start a checklist and then know it's too much and you have to remove photographs from the checklist, and then you get into the mini galleries, which is a to scale little gallery, and you end up having to cut things, or something joins the collection after the checklist is finished. So this photograph by Ashley Gilbertson entered the photography collection in April, and that was just a little too late to make it into the exhibit. Some works were on view too recently to be exhibited again due to how photographs are sensitive to light. Like this work by female photographer Dickie Chappelle, she was actually killed on assignment. This photograph was on view a couple of rotations ago in the collection gallery. This photograph by Susan Meiselis was also on view too recently. And again, works that couldn't fit on the wall. The museum has many photographs of the Lincoln assassination conspirators and their executions. And then there are photographers I wish could have been represented and didn't get a chance to be in the exhibit. Larry Burroughs, he covered the Vietnam War and died when his helicopter was shot down. Don McCullen, this is an extremely powerful image. And these are all in the collection. Carl Maidans, he photographed in World War II, and him and his wife were actually captured by the Japanese for 2 years before being released as part of a prisoner exchange. And he still continued to photograph. So here we have a photograph of refugees fleeing during the Korean War. Another artist that reacted to conflict, in this case the Cambodian genocide, is Bin Don, and this work was recently in a selections rotation as well, so I couldn't put it on display again. Now, to really end this talk, I want to acknowledge those documenting in Ukraine. There are incredibly powerful images that are being circulated, and they're not in the collection yet, and it's something for the curatorial team to discuss and think about. How do we go about representing current conflict, future conflict in the collection. So thank you for coming today, for listening, for viewing the exhibition. If anybody has any questions, I'm sure we have time for them. I'll also head down to the gallery. There are a couple of images I didn't talk about, so if you want to talk about them down there. Thank you.